Good evening, everyone. Again, we are here for the Race and Racism discussion series, and tonight's issue is going to be around race and education. I am Dr. Sean Coleman. I am the facilitator, an associate professor in our Educational Studies and Leadership Department, and facilitator. I am honored to have the good Dr. Hakim Rashid, our expert discussant from Howard University, and I will introduce him in just a little while. Before I forget, though, I want to take a moment to say thank you to our previous expert discussants. Sometimes I get so moving into our discussion, I get so amped that I forget some really important things. So I want to make sure I put this on the front, that I am so grateful for Dr. Tahari Jackson, Dr. Julius Davis, Dr. Latanya Brown Robertson, Dr. Charles Adams, and tonight's expert discussant, Dr. Hakim Rashid. Through the collective of our experts, we've been able to tackle some really important issues around racism. Of course, not all the issues because it's so vast, but definitely we're able to hit some heavy hitters. Racism in the pandemic, economics, criminal justice, and tonight, education. So thank you to all of my expert discussants. What we'll do this evening is what we've done for the past 3 evenings is I'll frame the discussion in this case around education and race. I'll introduce the good Dr. Hakim Rashid, and we'll fuss and discuss around some issues around with regard to racism and education, and then we'll go to class. And I'll begin here. The story continues. Much of the same of what we've talked about over the last few weeks, but to add a framing construct, still here with racism as a social construct. And although we can start from 1619 and even before, as Dr. Charles Adams has reminded us last week or so, we'll start here in the early 1900s when early proponents of social Darwinism, the nature perspective, suggest that the Negro lies near to the childhood of man. African Americans possess instinctive submissiveness, and African Americans are of a backwards race. There's more, though, when we talk about the nurture side of the coin, if you will, to suggest that there is stimulus deprivation in the Black community, the Black household. So much so where the Black household is lacking in toys, play objects, conversation with adults. And then when there is enough toys, and conversation, it's too much of the wrong stimulus. And then there's a space where nature and nurture intersect, where proponents have suggested that Blacks lacked impulse control. They have dampened intellectual curiosity. And there's a failure to demonstrate internal motivation mechanisms. All this part of this deficit model perspective versus the nature and the nurture and an intersection of the two. We'll pause here to lay a little bit of groundwork around this education opportunity gaps, formerly known as the achievement gap. There are 3 major ones that I often discuss. I'll give honorable mention to 2 of them, but we're going to really focus in on this minority group versus majority group, racism in education in particular. But let's make sure that we keep our eye on America's students versus the world, where according to our international counterparts, we are still lagging behind in education, partially because we are still working with an antiquated system lending to a 20th century preparation versus a 21st century preparation opportunity gap. This is a snapshot of the racial opportunity gap between whites and Blacks. There are several other examples, if you will, and this example only spans a couple of decades. But this opportunity gap goes back to 1972 when they start tracking it in education. That opportunity gap did not just start there, however. It landed much earlier than that with the mental testing movement and some of the first IQ tests as early as, I believe it was 1914, in preparation for World War I. This opportunity gap, or the trends of it, suggests a normalization of failure. It's a normalization of failure. Yes, the goal has always been to enhance achievement and academic performance for all students. But it was sort of acceptable that African Americans and other marginalized groups were notably behind, and this trend persists for decades. Part of the reason why this trend persists is that it is a blame the victim mentality, pointing the finger at the African Americans themselves. Well, we already talked about before, while there's a biological or innate responsibility to a Black person. In this particular framework, there is no way that the African American can enhance or increase their intellectual capacity, according to these social Darwinists, if you will. Further, coupled with that is this increased mental health issues based on racism and oppression. However, Dr. Grace Carroll and Dr. Howard Stevenson suggest that actually the family, community, and spirituality and religion are all mechanisms that support well mental health in the Black community. Interestingly, though, these same mechanisms are in many other communities, white communities as well. However, for some strange reason, they're not adequate in the Black community. The notion of low motivation, well, Dr. Margaret Bill Spencer debunks this as well, suggests that actually Blacks are intrinsically motivated, and even more so when you give them some culture and historical framework or background. Dr. Cynthia Garcia Cole tells us that voluntary and involuntary immigrants both value education and aspire to high standards for their children. And I mention this little piece here because there is a rampant ideal, and it's longstanding, that Black families don't care about their children's education, but they do. The notion, this is a slippery slope here, the notion around, well, poverty is the issue. It's because Blacks are more likely to be poor. Well, that might have some validity somewhere, but if you look at the NAEP reports, the academic achievement gap, or the opportunity gap, is even wider as you go up in SES. So I'll revisit the term ceteris paribus. All things being equal, when you increase the income, the academic achievement gap or the opportunity gap widens even more. Well, the education system was not built necessarily to account for the African American. It ignored African Americans largely. The system was generally built to socialize the current white population, to socialize the new European immigrants, and to prepare for the industrial workforce that was preparing for that industry prior to World War I, and we're still using that system. A saying that I like to say: whenever you point a finger out to someone, 3 fingers point back at you. Teacher quality is an aspect of really what's going on in the institution that promotes race and racism issues. Oftentimes, newer teachers who are less experienced are placed in low-income, poor Black communities. In addition, many troubled teachers who have been found to be ineffective, are placed in these same communities. The classroom climate alone is oftentimes devoid of cultural diversity, where there's no taking into account traditional, functional, environmental culture. And oftentimes there's less or limited, if not none or no, culturally sensitive learning environments. There is this notion of low expectations, and that speaks to teacher-student relationship quality. Based on the previous information that I presented, and look, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I can't present all of it. It's just not enough time in my 10 minutes or less. But largely, teachers are asserting low expectations on African American students because of either the belief of the innate inability or their cultural deprivation. This interaction between teachers and students is punitive, curt, and closed to positive interactions with those Black students. I also want to make note that 80%, approximately, it's really 79%, 80% of the teaching force are white teachers, and a large majority of that population, excuse me, is of white female. As you see the numbers here presented here, 9% Hispanic or Latinx, and 7% Black. Of the Black percentage, let me rephrase, of the entire percentage, only 2% of Black men. And then you have 2% Asian. So there is something said around being taught by people who look like you. And I want to possibly explore that further with Dr. Rashid. All of that is tootsie rolled into an exclusionary discipline. Unequal punishment is assigned to Blacks for the same offenses as whites, and the numbers are historically not only increased but more harsh. Black students are suspended and expelled at higher rates and for minor infractions compared to whites. This speaks to how much time our Black students pushed out of our classrooms, in addition to alienating our students as well. It doesn't have to be this way, though. We don't have to have these opportunity gaps. There are opportunities of success and not gap. And some of the research and recent research shows that if you provide a space where there's meaningful learning, you also engender belongingness from the student and remove the wall of alienation. When you include home indices, when you bring in ideals and psychological manifestations of the home, you change the focus from performance goal orientation to mastery goal orientation. And then you also have students believing that their cognition is not fixed, that they can actually be smarter and learn. Using culture and community is another aspect that's been shown to be very effective to close this opportunity gap, where you have this interdependency between students, you have the shared buy-in, and it leads to enhanced capability. But the latest research shows that this goes for teachers as well. More research shows that when you show high expectations of a student, you don't have to do much. Just tell them that you believe in them. Spend 10 to 15 seconds doing that. Do that often, that immediately. It's not a process that is long-term. It is immediate that they increase their cognition, their effort, and their persistence. And then lastly, in some of the latest research at least, when you are in a such situation or learning settings where there's rigorous learning, if you are including asset-based strategies, meaningful learning, collaboration, teacher-student relationship quality, students believe that they can do well and perceive themselves to be smarter at the end of the day. These are in STEM situations, STEM contexts. But let's talk more about this concept, these notions, racism in education, with the good Dr. Hakim Rashid. Here's our expert discussant, as I mentioned previously. Dr. Rashid is a mentor to many, to be honest with you. As I mentioned last semester when he joined us, he has mentored several across the region, if not across the country, and internationally for that matter. He's a professor and former chairperson of the Department of Human Development and Psychoeducational Studies in the School of Education at the Howard University. He received his bachelor's degree in psychology from Pomona College in Claremont, California, his master's degree in early childhood education, and an interdisciplinary PhD in education and psychology from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. There is so much that this gentleman has presented. He has a long history of experience and academia that I'm going to have to provide the other slice of bread and skip down. He is also a former co-editor of the online journal, The African American Learner. And most recently, Dr. Rashid has produced and directed a documentary film entitled Strange Fruit Redo: The Perils of Young Black Boys in Early Childhood Education. Dr. Rashid, thank you so very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Dr.
Before I move
Coleman.
on, Dr. Rashid, I want to give you, let you transition to posting your slide deck. But what did I miss? Did anything that I missed? Anything you want to highlight about some recent work that you've done, or some work that you've done that may not be recent that you just want to make sure that we know?
Well, let's see. I've been involved in a few things. I guess the most recent thing is not anything directly to do with education, but I'm working with a group that's trying to put together a coalition to change the name of Prince George's County to Tubman Douglas County. And I can provide more information on that later, and also ask for volunteers that might want to be involved in that effort. I know I've already talked to you a little bit about it. But also, we're a group of us from Howard are getting ready to do a professional development institute down in Jamaica for the early childhood commission down there. We did a in-person in-service with them a couple years ago with one of the schools down there.
Yes.
But now we'll be doing something for the entire country's early childhood commission. So we're looking forward to that. Unfortunately, it's going to be virtual, and we're not going to be going down to Jamaica in person, but we look forward to doing that soon.
What else? You're laying the seeds for us to go down there later, right?
Yeah, it's trying to lay the foundation.
That's right.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Appreciate the introduction. Let's see what we can do here. And you see that? Let's see here. Here we go.
There we go, sir.
Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
All righty. So my charge was to talk about race and racism in education. And after Dr. Coleman asked me to do this, I had to kind of sit back and say, where do I start? You know, because there has been race and racism in education in the United States of America from the beginning. You know, so it's like, okay, touching the elephant and trying to determine what it is. Are you touching the trunk? Are you touching the tail? Are you touching the body? So we can just dive right in. And first of all, talk about how education as a system here in the United States does exactly what it's supposed to do. It perpetuates a classist and racist society from one generation to the next. And that's the function of education in any society, is to protect that culture, to perpetuate the culture's values from one generation to the next. So we have a schizophrenic kind of culture here in the United States. The paperwork, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, all of the stuff on paper is saying, oh, it's egalitarian, we have equal opportunity for all. But when you really dig into the nuts and bolts and you look at the history, you see that it is replete with white supremacy from day one. Now, let's take a look at a quote here from Dr. Francis Welsing, and I've got to try to move the picture out of the way here so I can look at the slide. So in 1989, Dr. Welsing published a paper called the ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors. I recommend it to everyone. And this quote here, I think, is very telling. She says, quote, recently, there has been an unraveling and an analysis of the core issue of the first global system of mass oppression, the power system of racism, white supremacy. Once the collective victim understands this fundamental issue and ultimately organizing of all of the appropriate behaviors necessary to neutralize the great injustice of the white supremacy power system will only be a matter of time. Now, so what she said, this is an old system. This is a system that has been with us from the beginning. And as we look at the emergence of African liberation systems, as we look at the emergence of the Black Power movement in the 1960s, we see this unraveling that has taken place. People are understanding more and more the nature of white supremacy. And Dr. Welsing's mentor had told her that if you don't understand white supremacy, you'll continue to be confused. And that's what we're really seeing here in the educational system. If you don't understand that this is a fundamentally racist educational system, you won't know what to do. You'll be, as Dr. Asa Hilliard talked about, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You'll be trying to save a sinking ship that really has, again, racism as its core. We can talk about a variety of dimensions of racism in education. We can talk about cultural racism, institutional racism, individual racism, systemic racism, and disconscious racism. And we'll hit on a few of these as we go along. But that first one, I think, is important because it takes us right back to the beginning. There is racism in the core culture of America, and that racism has transmitted itself into the educational system. Now, to make that point, I want to give you a quote from Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Mask. And, he's talking to the African diaspora here, but I think that we have to look at anything that Fanon says and say, how does this apply to me? How does this apply to us here in the African-American community? And let's take a look at this quote. He says, quote, "Every colonized people, in other words, every people in whose soul an inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is, with the culture of the mother country. The colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards." All right, let me repeat that last sentence. The colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. Now, Dr. Coleman laid out this jungle status that we've been forced to deal with, this whole notion of white supremacy that has permeated the social sciences here in America from day one. And it is these social sciences that inform the discipline of education, the practice of education in America. So there's really no way that the American educational system can be anything but racist, because it was born and founded in racism. Everything that contributes to it is racist. I want to give you another quote here from a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, and I highly recommend that to everybody, by James Lowen. When I read that book and just kind of looked at, my own education and all the various lies that my teachers had told me, I was so profoundly grateful for my parents and their ability to counteract those lies by having things like Jet and Ebony in the house, and by having books like Lerone Bennett's Before the Mayflower in the house, and by giving me a constant message that I was great as a young Black man from day one. But here's what Lowen says about one of the people that informed his work. It says, quote, "Educator Martha Toppin found unanimous agreement with this proposition among 90 high school students. And here's the proposition: if Africa had a history worth learning about, we would have had it last year in Western civilization." That's the proposition. So this message that Eurocentric history sends to non-Europeans is, according to Lowen, your ancestors have not done much of importance. And again, this is one of those things that I could certainly relate to at a very personal level, having taken Western civilization in high school, having taken American history in high school, like many of us, many of you have done. You don't see much in the way of Africa. Now, let's focus a minute on teachers, teacher preparation, and how teacher education programs perpetuate the racism that is characteristic of the culture. Teachers have to take psychology. And we certainly know from Dr. Coleman that is a discipline rooted in racist assumptions about intelligence, racist assumptions about Black people and their mentality. They have to take sociology. That is a discipline that is replete with studies of Black family dysfunction. We go all the way back to 1965. Daniel Moynihan came out with a report called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. And in this report, he talks about the Black family being what he called a tangle of pathology, because at that point, 1965, 20% of Black families were headed by women. Now that same figure holds now for white families. There's about 20% of white families that are headed by women, but you don't hear anybody talking about the white family being a tangle of pathology. Teachers in training, pre-service teachers have to take philosophy. And those philosophy classes usually start with the Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. And they don't talk about the Black people who educated them, the ancient people of Kemet, the so-called ancient Egyptians. All of these great, the original great Greek philosophers, they studied in ancient Africa. They brought back the philosophical systems that they had gotten in ancient Africa. Socrates was persecuted for corrupting the morals of the young. They forced him to commit suicide. What was happening? He was bringing back this philosophy that he had gotten in ancient Kemet. Teachers have to take history classes. And these are certainly characterized by Eurocentrism, this notion that Africa has given nothing of value to the world, that Black history, particularly Black American history, begins with slavery. So again, the teachers are incorporating this into an already racist worldview. And they have to take child development courses. And what is the norm? The norm is the white child. Typically, the studies of Black infant psychomotor precocity are usually ignored. And this is a body of research that goes back to the mid-1930s. In the mid-1930s, in fact, one of the first studies was done down in Jamaica, looking at comparisons of white babies and Black babies and their psychomotor development, and using a scale that was developed by one of the most prominent white psychologists of his time, Arnold Gazelle. So it's called the Gazelle infant scales. And in decade after decade, Black babies showed that their psychomotor development was more advanced than that of white babies. And I'll show you how this kind of plays itself out in research. And I have to get the time frame here, it was about 40 years ago, I was working as a researcher at the High Scope Foundation in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And they've done a lot of the major longitudinal effects of preschool education research, a lot of the research that undergirds the Head Start programs. And they would always hire a black research assistant to go out into the Black community to interview the parents and talk to the kids, et cetera. And one of the Black research assistants told me that she was really upset because she had gone out and asked, one of the questions was, how early did your baby walk? And the Black mothers were saying, well, my baby walked 9, 10 months old. And she would bring this information back to the white researchers, and they were saying, well, these ladies must be lying. There's no way that any babies could walk that early because, again, they're looking at the Gazelle developmental norms where the white babies are walking at 12 and 13 months old. So again, if we're going to talk about normal child development, at some point, we're going to have a science of normal Black child development. And these teachers are also taking these methods courses, which are preparing them to deal with what is considered the normal Black child or the normal white child. And anything that might deviate from that is considered aberrant. So they've already learned that Black people are inferior from a variety of different educational disciplines. And then ultimately they go out and they learn how to apply this information in the real world, which is really the real world of the normal white child. Now, I mentioned something called disconscious racism. And it's important that we consider this notion of disconscious racism as we think about what teachers are bringing into the educational setting. Now, again, remember, 80% of teachers in America are white. Most of them are white women, all right? Now, what is disconscious racism? Let's see what Wellman says, as Joyce King quoted him. Disconscious racism is a form of racism that tacitly accepts white norms and privileges. It is not the absence of consciousness, that is not unconsciousness, but an impaired consciousness or a distorted way of thinking about race as compared to, for example, critical consciousness. Uncritical ways of thinking about racial inequity accept certain culturally sanctioned assumptions, myths, and beliefs that justify the social and economic advantages white people have as a result of subordinating diverse others. So again, this is the way it is. This is the thinking of the masses of white people here in America. They take their privilege for granted. They take their privilege as an example or as reflective of their superiority. They see the problems that Black people are having in the society as their fault, because of that legacy of savageness, that legacy of being subordinated. And again, this is what they bring to the classroom with them. So the Brookings Institution did a survey not long ago. And what they found is that in spite of the education that teachers may have, that they are just as racist as everybody else. And they say that teachers hold on the average pro-white, anti-Black bias at levels comparable to those of the general population. So again, nothing in their training, nothing in their higher education has done anything to alleviate the racism that they have brought with them from the culture. And that's really a shame when you really think about it, that people are going to these institutions of higher learning, they're getting bachelor's degrees, they're getting master's degrees, they're getting PhDs, they're going out to train other teachers, and they are just as racist as everybody else, just as racist as Joe the plumber, just as racist as that white high school dropout from, and I don't want to stereotype anybody from West Virginia, but we know the stereotypes, that teachers across America are just as racist. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at the language that's used, the Brookings Institution is saying that they hold on the average pro-white, anti-Black bias levels at levels compared. They don't really talk about racism. They don't really talk about white supremacy. And I think we're all old enough to realize that terms like bias and discrimination and prejudice are much less on the mark than white supremacy, because typically the response is, well, anybody can be biased. Well, anybody can be prejudiced. Well, anybody can discriminate against people based on their color. And that may be all well and true, but white supremacy is another animal. This idea that the white race is superior to everybody else on the planet, that is something unique to Europeans. Now, they go on to talk about how these biases matter. Again, using that term bias. And this quote here from that report kind of sums up the effects of racism. Again, they're calling it implicit bias, and that's another new term that has become very popular, implicit bias. That teachers are bringing these biases with them that they really, they just don't know anything about. But it's a very, emotionally neutral kind of term. Other research shows that teachers' implicit racial and ethnic biases are associated with lower expectations of students. Now, again, Dr. Coleman alluded to this, but there's a whole body of research that goes back to the late 1960s that talks about teachers' low expectations for children who are not like them. Teachers' low expectations for children from different socioeconomic groups. They're from different racial groups, and certainly Black students have fallen on the bottom of that totem pole. Worse instruction quality. The teachers don't even make an attempt to teach Black children who they hold low expectations for at the same level of quality. Pedagogical choices, what kind of information, what kind of strategies are used. Less concern for fostering mutually respectful classroom environments, and that these factors negatively impact the academic achievement of minority students. Now, again, this term minority to what? We know that people of color in the United States are part of a global majority in terms of people of color. Some people have moved away from the term minority and use the term minority status, which means that, again, even though you may be in a majority situation and you're from an oppressed group, you have a historically minority status. Bias contribute to the documented disparities and how minority students are disciplined. Again, a whole body of research on that phenomena. And more recently, we've seen it rear its ugly head, even at the preschool level. We see that even at the preschool level, Black boys are disproportionately expelled from preschool. How does that happen? How do you get disproportionately expelled as a preschooler, as a 3-year-old, as a 4-year-old? And again, says not only do these biases directly impact students' educational experiences, but students' perceptions that their teachers hold biases against them can adversely affect their academic engagement. Of course, they're not going to, if they see their teacher as racist, if they see their teacher as having lower expectations, they're going to be much less likely to be involved in the academic process. Now, educator by the name of Kazembe in the conversation not too long ago, he's talking about his own experience with predominantly white pre-service teachers. And he says that I find that most of these white students possess little to no understanding of their own racial and ethnic identities. And again, this is part of that American educational process, trying to homogenize everyone, trying to make sure that everyone sees themselves as American, as opposed to focusing in on any kind of distinct ethnic identities. He says, also, I observe that they aren't familiar with even basic aspects of US history, such as the contributions and experiences of Native Americans and African Americans. And again, we know this from the curriculum, the pre-service teacher education curriculum, again, rooted in racism, rooted in ethnocentrism. And as a Black man, this is a Black man going out and having to teach pre-service education. I can certainly relate to his experiences. I'll reflect back on some experiences I had when I was teaching at the University of South Carolina, well over about 35 years ago. All of my evaluations of my teaching were considered below the departmental norm, but I would always have 3 or 4 hardcore racist students in the class. They didn't want to hear anything from a Black man. They didn't want to hear anything about the need to expand our idea of inclusivity in terms of education. So they would always revert back to the racist information that they had brought from their own cultural context. And so as an instructor, I just kept, trying to beat the drum and say, wait a minute, there's another way of looking at this. I was talking to Dr. Coleman about my first exposure to the book Stolen Legacy by Dr. George James, a book that came out in 1954 that documents how the Greeks stole their philosophy from the Egyptians. Well, one of my students that I exposed that to down at Jackson State University was a white woman who was out teaching in the Jackson, Mississippi schools. And she came and she said that, she thought I was crazy and that this was a bunch of nonsense and that she was going to use her term paper to prove me wrong. Well, at the end of and I said, well, fine, you go ahead, show me what you got. And so she came back at the end of the semester and she says, well, I only have one criticism of what you've given us, and that's that you didn't go far enough back in African history. So I felt good about that, needless to say. But again, we've got this situation where, even if teachers are exposed to Black professors and Black teacher educators, their own biases are leading them to conclude that something else is going on. And so Kazembe, he kind of concludes his thing saying that because they live in a multicultural nation, I believe that it is more important than ever for them to acquire a serious understanding of racism and this nation's rich multicultural history. I also think they will become better teachers if they leverage that understanding and work to become anti-racist. So this is what we have to, in a sense, aspire to, trying to make this existing crop of teachers. The demographics for teachers is going to stay the same well into the future. It's not projected to change. It doesn't look like anything is going to change it. So 80% of teachers are going to be white people, most of them white women, most of them having very little experience with Black people as a whole. So we've got to aspire to turn this teacher preparation curriculum into an anti-racist curriculum by trying to expose white teachers, and unfortunately, too many Black teachers, to a knowledge of the contributions of people of African descent to history and that broad span of African history. Now, I'm going to close out the formal part of my presentation with another quote, and this is from a young Black man from the Bronx High School for the Visual Arts. He wrote this speech for a Black History Month program, but it was so controversial that it was never presented. And I'll let you make your decision about how controversial what he says really is. And this is from Carl Nolden. Quote, "What I have to say is designed for the enlightenment of those who suffer from a school system that hypocritically manipulates Black history in a way that causes a disconnection from Black students and their history. If you try to make a Black child coexist with a racist school system or a Eurocentric school system, then you are basically putting that child back into slavery, perhaps mental slavery. There's something wrong with the educational system and the country. I believe the parents should take an active role in challenging the school system and even the curriculum of this school so that any residue of Eurocentrism is gone. All the history teachers I ever had were white. And from every last one of them, I never received the link to the genius of Africa. Those teachers always taught European history with a much stronger emphasis. The result was I was brainwashed. And I think that many of us would identify with Carl and say, yeah, we were brainwashed too, but we have to spend as much time, I think, educating our parents, letting our parents know that they have to teach their children about Black history, Black culture, the genius of Africa, as he refers to, because the educational system is not likely to change. So we have a lot of vehicles for educating our parents. We have the churches, we have the religious institutions, we have the sororities and fraternities, we have other organizations that are going to have to take on this mantle of trying to remove the brainwashing from the minds of Black children. We can't depend on the education system. As I said at the beginning, the education system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, and that's perpetuate a racist and classist system from one generation to the next. I graduated from high school in 1968. This young man graduated in 2007. We've got another generation coming through, and I would argue that most of them are not learning in the aggregate any more about African history, African culture than we did during my day. So something has to change, and it's up to us to try to do it. So thank you, Dr. Coleman. I'm gonna stop sharing here and we can go into some discussion.
Dr. Rashid, you always bring the heat. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Speaking of pre-conversations, pre-presentation conversations, you and I talked about, you senior researchers, you always got a trick in your bag. There's always something that you guys can pull out that
Just
are
live long enough.
more junior researchers are still learning. So I appreciate you. Thank you. Of course, of course, your presentation is very enlightening. And per the usual speaker events that we've had, you and I have had some back and forth, even if mild, around the questions that we might talk about, although it will be organic. You've answered a lot of them, but one of them that, for the sake of time, I'd like to sort of go to my second question for you, and then maybe I'll go back to the first, which involves the Brown v. Board of Education. But I'll read this to you. Last semester, we discussed the importance of same-race teachers for our students. Is this a factor in closing the racial opportunity gap? You conducted a lot of work, extensive work that is, regarding Black boys and child development and education being one of those factors. How do you think Black male teachers can contribute to the field overall and to Black boys' development in the classroom?
Oh, I think it's critical to try to get as many Black males into education as possible. You cited that figure 2%, and unfortunately, there aren't any prospects for it changing radically. But we need young Black men to go into the field of education even as early as possible. I'll just relate an experience that I had when I was a preschool center director back in the late 70s. I hired a young Black man to teach in the preschool and as an assistant teacher. And well, it just so happens that this young man was formerly incarcerated. But that showed me right away that as we put more Black males into classrooms, I had the benefit of being a preschool teacher under a couple of Black women while I was in graduate school, and I learned women are center directors, they're lead teachers, and you better learn to get along. But I think that we're in a kind of an inflection point now, where we see this movement to bring formerly incarcerated young men back into society. And I think a lot of people would probably disagree with me and say, "Oh, we don't want to put them in the classroom." I think we're going to have to look at that. If they haven't been convicted of some type of sex crime or child abuse or a violent crime, if they just been in there for selling a few ounces of marijuana or something like that, let's retool them. We see universities like Georgetown, for example, offering bachelor's degrees inside prison walls.
Yes.
We need to turn some of these young men into teachers and get them in the classroom. But that's I probably said more than your question called for. But I do believe it's important that we try to get as many young men as possible in the classroom. And that question of same race, the research bears that out, that Black children learn better from Black teachers. The problem is that most Black children are not getting any kind of significant number of Black teachers throughout their lifetime.
Yes. Thank you for that, Dr. Rashid. Shout out to Dr. Julius Davis, actually, for the Center for Research and Mentoring of Black Male Students and Teachers. He's definitely put an assertive effort, more so than this. I mean, he's put everything into trying to get more Black men
Absolutely
in front of students' faces.
Absolutely.
So thank you. One other question before we take it to the overall questions. I'm going to go back to my first one, although I had like 5 or so questions. When you talk about the education system doing what it's supposed to be doing what it was built to do, if you will, but then how do we reconcile the Brown v. Board of Education finding in desegregation?
Well, we have to deconstruct Brown v. Board of Education in the sense that when we look at the lead up to Brown v. Board of Education, the issue was separate and unequal.
Yes.
Okay. The issue was that Black children, particularly in the South, were being educated in all Black schools, but they weren't getting the kind of resources that the white schools were getting. And so to my understanding, the court case was designed to try to bring about a parity. In other words, give Black educators resources, give Black school systems resources, but it did get transformed into an integration issue. We saw Black psychologists like Kenneth Clark arguing that segregation was detrimental to the identity of Black children based on the doll studies.
Yes.
But I'm not convinced that the doll studies really proved that it was going to school with other Black children that made Black children choose the white doll. That was more of a cultural phenomena. That was more of something that Black children saw in the broader culture. They saw the elevation of white standards of beauty. They saw the lack of Black dolls. So of course they're going to want to play with that white doll.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Brown versus Board of Education became a struggle to integrate the schools. The assumption being, and again, I would question this assumption, the assumption being that if Black children were going to school with white children, that they would get a quality education. Now, the years since Brown have shown that that's not necessarily the case, because one of the first things that happened was that schools began to resegregate based on test scores. So even though you had schools that were nominally integrated, ultimately you might have most of the Black children being put in one track and the white kids in another track because of standardized test scores.
Right.
Now let me just kind of digress for a minute to talk about my first experience with going to school with white kids, because that did a lot to shape my attitude toward this whole area. Now, I grew up in Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan is the birthplace of General Motors, very vibrant place to grow up in the 50s and 60s. More recently, it's just become known for having bad water and being a poor town, but that wasn't the case when I was growing up. So
Yeah.
I grew up in a Black neighborhood and went to a Black elementary school. And my first experience going to school with white kids, and this will kind of blow your mind, there were white kids that were bused into our all Black elementary school. They had a neighborhood that was across the major highway that didn't have enough people to have its own school. So the white kids went to these little trailer units from kindergarten through third grade. And then in the fourth grade, they were actually literally bused to our all Black elementary school in the Black neighborhood. So that's how I got to know white kids. And it was an advantage because there was no mystique. These kids weren't coming from any affluent background. Their parents were factory workers, just like our parents were factory workers. We were living in a new subdivision, many of us. They were living in a new subdivision. What we found out in the fourth grade is that there were some dumb white kids and there were some smart white kids, So I took that with me all the way through high school, certainly. But I never had this idea that, okay, by these white kids coming here and being in our classroom, that's somehow going to make us smarter as Black children. And so I never bought into that idea that Black kids had to go to school with white kids in order to get a quality education. What we've seen over the years is that there's been so much opposition to integrated schools that Brown has never really even fulfilled its mandate. But what we have seen over the last 40, even 50 years, is that there have been pockets of Black achievement, all Black achievement around the country. And Dr. Asa Hilliard did a great job of documenting many of those schools. These are all Black schools that had high levels of Black achievement. So it's not necessary for Black children to go to school with white children in order to get a quality education. And in fact, we probably should quit even asking for it and focus more on what can we do to provide a high quality education to Black children wherever they are.
Yes. Is it too far-fetched to say that before Brown v. Board of Education, that for Black communities, the education system was essentially a different system and yet effective?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we can look at, there have been examples here in Washington, D.C., Dunbar High School, was an all Black school that produced a lot of high achieving people. In the South, we found that certainly Black people in the South knew a lot more about Black history and culture in all Black settings. And ultimately, when integration came about with Brown, and I want to refer everybody to the work of Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker,
yes,
who's done a lot in this area. There were something like 30,000 Black teachers that lost their jobs when the schools were integrated, And so this is a tremendous loss. And I don't know if we've ever really recovered from that. But yes, Black children were learning about themselves. They were learning to read and write. They were going on to accomplish careers, going on to HBCUs in the South, and really a much more accomplished educational portfolio, if you will, than in many communities in the North that had been integrated for years. Both of my parents, growing up in Flint, Michigan in the 1930s, went to integrated high schools integrated schools in the 1930s. When my mother finished high school, she wasn't allowed to go to the white nursing school in town and had to go all the way to St. Louis to go to nursing school. So the opportunities just weren't there. So again, we don't have to sit next to white kids to get a quality education.
Sure. So we have a few more minutes, Dr. Rashid, and thank you for of course being here and answering some questions. I'm going to open it up to the whole group, and Some folks will put in the chat, either if you're on YouTube or in Zoom, any questions. In the meantime, while some people are formulating their questions, we do have an early question from my good colleague, Dr. Julius Davis. Dr. Davis, he asked two questions, but I'll go to a second first with an implication of his first question. Dr. Rashid, what do you think of the increase of anti-racism teachers who do not have a proper understanding of racism? And let me just add, Dr. Rashid, implicit in that is this notion around anti-racism. So I'll just repeat that real quick. What do you think of the increase of this notion, quote unquote, anti-racism teachers who do not really have a proper understanding of racism?
Well, I think, my speculation is that the whole effort will be doomed to failure until these teachers get an understanding of white supremacy. And I think we have to call a spade a spade. We saw the whole movement in terms of multicultural education in the 1970s and the 80s. I think that was kind of a smoke screen. I'm hoping that this is not a smoke screen too, because anti-racist teachers are going to have to learn about themselves. They're going to have to reflect on the racism that has gotten them to where they are. And it's going to take a lot more than just saying I'm anti-racist. Yes. So there's a lot of undergirding, a lot of philosophical work that's going to have to be done. I hope I'm addressing that question, but
yeah, you got a thumbs up, actually.
Okay, good.
Virtual thumbs up on that. Yeah, or and indeed from Dr. Davis, absolutely. So unless I have another question brewing, I'll go to one of mine. And I think you addressed this. I was going to ask you, how does education impact people's lives, and why is racism important to address in education?
Well, racism is important in education because education is important. In other words, we see the relationship between educational attainment and life outcomes.
Yes.
The further you go educationally, the better you do in terms of income, options for you in terms of occupations. So it's part and parcel of the culture that the further you go, the better you do. Yeah. But the problem is that the impact that racist education has on people's self-esteem, on their ability to be productive within the educational context. I mean, if you've got a situation where white teachers are systematically discriminating and exhibiting racist behaviors toward Black children over time, then to what extent are those Black children internalizing the behaviors or the attitudes and behaviors of those white teachers? And that's why it's so important to have counterbalancing forces, why we have to get to parents, why we have to get to communities to say, hey, you've got to do something to protect the identity of your children as they matriculate through a system that was not really designed to benefit them.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I want to take an opportunity to give an honorable mention to my good colleague, Dr. Otis Williams, who brought his whole class in this evening. Dr. Williams and I are HU brothers.
I remember Dr. Williams from his days at HU.
That's right, that's right. He presents a question to you, and he says, Dr. Rashid, you mentioned Frantz Fanon's work related to colonialism. Under the present education system, can Blacks achieve decolonization and liberation as defined by Fanon?
Well, in terms of as defined by Fanon, he talked a lot about the international situation. And I think that we can certainly work toward the goals that he strove for, that other I guess you would say anti-colonial educators, even people like Paulo Freire with pedagogy of the oppressed, But these are things that are going to have to go on at local levels. School boards are going to have to be fights within local school boards about curriculum. We see such a conservative thrust now. We could even go back when we begin to see the emergence of African-centered education in the 1990s. The white scholars brought out their heavyweights to argue that the black scholars were lying. We have to just keep pushing. You have to just keep pushing. So I know Fanon, is an icon in the Algerian Revolution. He's an icon in terms of Black psychology, and I think that we have to use his analysis where we can to apply to our own situation. And those solutions that he's talked about, I think that writers like himself that can be adopted to our situation.
Yes. I have a comment and then a final question, Dr. Rashid. A follow-up comment from Dr. Davis. One, he gives a shout out to the HU brothers. Thank you, Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis went to the esteemed Morgan State University for his terminal degree. So we are all brothers.
That's right.
Alike. This is the unfortunate thing about this anti-racism conversation is that Black people are calling themselves racist and making racism a comfortable space for white folks. So you want to respond?
Black people are calling themselves racist.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's a mistake. That's a mistake. As a Black person, you might say, well, yeah, I've got some prejudices. I've been known to discriminate, but we have to talk about racism and white supremacy in the same phrase.
Yes.
We can't, here in the United States, we don't have the luxury of just saying, okay, we're all in the same boat. We're all racist and we all should try to be anti-racist. No, we're not all white supremacists. We're not all white supremacists. And many of us have been battling against white supremacy virtually our whole lives by our virtual existence, fighting against white supremacy. So, again, that's one of those things that if we buy into that notion too much, it's doomed to failure.
Yes.
It's doomed to failure.
Dr. Rashid, if you had a magic wand, maybe not a magic wand, but you pick your number, your grant award number, right? You pick. What would you do, or what could be done to adequately address racism in education?
Whoa. Again, I think that,
and I'm sorry, Dr. Rashid, that wasn't one of the questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, interestingly enough, I wouldn't start with children. I would start with parents. I would say that we would have to have a massive, I guess you would say, culturally sensitive parent education thrust. Teaching parents what they need to know about the educational system that their children are about to matriculate through. Again, particularly parents of children that are just getting ready to go into the system. I certainly feel fortunate to have had parents that focused on knowing something about myself as a Black person, but also had high expectations for me. So again, any kind of parent education thrust is going to have to focus on knowing yourself culturally, knowing yourself in terms of your competencies, knowing that your child is born a genius and that you have to cultivate that genius, that you have to be involved with that school system, regardless of whether it's an all Black school system, a half Black school system, or 10% Black school system. You're going to have to be involved in your child's education from day one. What does that mean? It certainly means monitoring their work, monitoring their relationships with their teachers, making sure that the teachers know you by name, because you're always there and involved.
Yes.
So that's how I, if I had to, try to wave that magic wand, focus in on parents and then I think the kids will take care of themselves, but I don't think that we're not going to magically turn the American teaching force into an anti-racist teaching force. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
So, and if I can be a consultant on your magic wand grant,
yeah,
I would want, if we're focusing on parents, I would want to also teach parents how to navigate the educational system, because oftentimes it's elusive. It keeps Black parents out, and it feels like on purpose, but institutionally,
absolutely,
to keep Black parents out. And I would go as far as to say is that before integration, the Black community navigated the education system for their child. It was community-based schooling.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We see pockets of that now.
Yes.
We can see places where there are Saturday school programs. We can see after school programs. We see, collections of charter schools that are doing the right thing, so to speak. But there's such a massive need.
Yes.
That's the issue. We're a nation of 35 million at least, and we are still depending on Europeans for our education.
Yes.
And if we're going to depend on them, then we have to certainly be able to navigate that system and understand what it's all about.
Absolutely. Dr. Rashid, thank you so much.
You're really welcome, as usual.
Your decades of support, Dr. Rashid. Thank you so much. I appreciate
it. Good seeing Dr. Williams is saying good seeing me, and it's good seeing him. I don't see him, but I'm gonna come out there and visit you once the air is clear, Dr. Williams.
Here I am. Good seeing you, Doc.
All righty.
All right.
We'll maybe at some point, Dr. Rashid, we can bring you back to for a viewing of Strange Fruit Redo.
Absolutely. I did when it first came out. I did a screening out there at Bowie State. This might have even been before you went out there.
Nope, I introduced you.
But I'll definitely want to come back.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Rashid, thank you so much. I want to start to wrap up this time today, just because we're running out of time, simply, but because we can talk about education, racism in education, and all the factors that inform it, right, for a very long time. But here, I want to close out. I want to just send a note to my class that we will reconvene at 7 during our class link, Zoom link. But from here, Dr. Rashid, again, I want to thank you so tremendously.
Okay. I'll be able to join the class for a few minutes. So, probably about 15, 20 minutes at 7.
We'll start at 7, and it's a separate link. So I'll send you that separate link.
Send me that link. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do.
Okay.
Dr. Julius Davis, thanks you, Dr. Rashid. He humbly thanks me for starting the Race and Racism speaker series. As you see, because all the audience can't see, Dr. Otis Williams is very thoughtful and very grateful to see you, and thanks for the speaker series. And Dr. Wendy Edmonds also says thank you, Dr. Rashid.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, yes. So I want to close up with my other big thank yous. I want to thank again the other expert discussants that have been throughout the speaker series. I want to thank Ms. Wedderburn in Conference Services, who is our oracle. We cannot do this without her. You guys don't realize the work that she does and keep us on point behind the scenes and during the session. So thank you so much, Ms. Wedderburn. Thank you for all the students, all the participants who are viewing on YouTube here in the Zoom. And I want to thank my in-house technology advisor, my youngest son, Nicholas, for making sure that my background looks decent. Everything, lets me try out my Zoom and make sure that I knock out some of the kinks. So with that being said, we're going to close out this evening. We're going to close out the speaker series. We're very humbled to have been able to conduct this speaker series. We touched on, as I started in the beginning, we touched on some really heavy hitter institutional spaces to include the pandemic that infuses everything for that matter. But economics, where we learned some things from Dr. Brown Robinson, criminal justice, where we learned some new things from Dr. Charles Adams, and we are always gracious to receive Dr. the good Dr. Hakim Rashid, to talk about education and racism. So without further ado, we'll close up shop here, sign off, and I will meet my class at 7 o'clock. And we look forward to next semester with another speaker series.